All right, well, in this video, we're going to continue to look at some of the substance and evidence that leads us to believe in the legitimacy of the Bible. And in this video, we're going to talk about the historical reliability of the Bible. You see, this is important because the Bible covers this wide swath of human history. It talks about all kinds of major people and leaders and events and movements. And if the Bible is legitimate, if it's from God, then you would assume that it's going to be an accurate record of history, that it's not going to be full of historical errors and fallacies. And in fact, if a book was full of such historical errors or fallacies, then you'd have very little reason to trust that it was actually from God. And so the question is the Bible really historically reliable? Well, when you discuss this issue, there's a couple main areas you want to consider. One of the main areas is in the field of archaeology. You see, with the rise of modern archaeological technology and advances, scientists and historians have been able to piece together a very accurate record of the history of the world. And so again, you would hope that the Bible lines up well with discovered archaeology. And when you look at the Bible, what you discover is that, in fact, it is very accurate according to archaeology. The Bible is, in fact, a very trusted historical artifact that's often referred to on archaeological digs. And very famous groups such as the Smithsonian Institute rely very heavily on the Bible in leading such archaeological digs. And you know, with more and more archaeological discoveries being made every day, the Bible has yet to be disproven by any piece of archaeology. And in fact, just the opposite has happened. It has been verified over and over again. Here's just one quick example of that, the tomb of Joseph. You know, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, the whole last third of the book of Genesis is devoted to telling the story of the life of this man named Joseph, who was a Jewish boy that ended up going and living in Egypt. And through a whole series of trials and travails, he ends up being a great leader, the governor over the whole nation of Egypt. And yet, the problem has been throughout history, there's not been a lot of record about this historical figure named Joseph, who was supposedly this very key figure in the nation of Egypt. And a lot of Egyptology didn't demonstrate that there was anybody actually named Joseph until very recently in the 20th century. They came across an archaeological dig and they discovered the tomb of this great Egyptian leader named Joseph. When they looked at the artifacts and the drawings that were contained in that tomb, what they discovered was this corresponded exactly with how the Bible describes the story of Joseph. And so yet again, the Bible was held up as being archaeologically accurate. Well, as you're discussing historical reliability, another thing you'd want to think about is secular history. How does the Bible line up with secular, non-religious history? I mean, you could say, well, you know, the Bible has a religious agenda to it, and so I'm sure they skewed the stories and the facts to fit its religious agenda, but how does that line up with what we actually know from history? Well, again, as we have discovered more and more history, what we have continued to discover is the Bible is very accurate, and it concurs with other non-religious histories. For example, you look at the Old Testament, we've discovered a great deal of ancient Near Eastern historical documents that talk about all these people groups that are described in the Old Testament. And as you look at those historical accounts, what you discover is they concur exactly with all sorts of Old Testament events and figures. For example, one thing we've seen is the story of the flood from the Old Testament, Noah and the flood. We see that in nearly every ancient Near Eastern secular history, there is a historical account of a great flood that happened in that nation. Now, they have different explanations as to where that came from, but they all talk about that same significant flood event that's described in the Old Testament. When you come to the New Testament, you have the same thing. As you look at Greek and Roman and secular Jewish histories, you find out that all of those historical accounts concur just like the New Testament says. One great example of this is with the life of Jesus. Now, throughout history, people have tried to claim that the historical Jesus as he's described in the Bible never really existed, and that he never really did or said any of those things he claimed, and that he was just sort of a mythical figure that was trumped up to try to inspire people in a difficult time. Well, as you look at these secular histories, what you discover is all the major events and significant facts about Jesus' life can be substantiated outside of the Bible in these secular historical accounts. Here's just a few facts that we can discover by looking at these. We discover that Jesus was indeed a real person who was from a town called Nazareth, that he lived a wise and virtuous life. It says that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate in Palestine, and this happened during the time of the Jewish Passover, and that he was mocked as the king of the Jews, that his disciples believed that he was raised from the dead after 3 days, that his disciples had this strange act where they would symbolically eat his flesh and drink his blood, which we of course know was referring to communion. And also we understand from secular history that his followers, they not only denied polytheism, which was prevalent in their day, but they worshiped Jesus as God himself. So as you look at these other historical accounts of history, you discover that they correspond exactly as the Bible describes. And again, this lends great evidence to the fact the Bible really is inspired from God. So go ahead and pause and discuss this question.